All right, my geniuses. How about a little Into the Wild, chapters 10, 11, and 12? Not a terrible amount to talk about with these chapters, especially with 10, a rather odd chapter, which is very forensic in nature. And it's the whole backstory of the body being found. Starts out with the newspaper clipping, if you will, and it just gives a very sort of, like I said, forensic detail of the body being discovered in the bus, and it's not very long. And stylistically, there's Krakauer's doing a little something here. Chapter 8 and 9 was filled with ethos and credibility for Chris McCandless and what he endeavored to do, but also a bit of pathos to feel bad for not only him, but all the others that got wrapped up in this whole get out into nature and escape civilization and ultimately die. Now, some people might not feel sorry for him. Some of those guys definitely got themselves killed from their own lack of preparedness. Okay, so this chapter is sort of almost like a flip over to pure logos, logic, facts, and figures, and and police work. So it just kind of is a nice switch in and almost a segue, if you will. And so we'll move on to 11, because 11 is where it starts to get a little bit more intense. And again, in the very beginning of 11, which starts on 103, we start getting into the backstory of Chris and his father. That is going to be the driving force. And if you're through 11 and 12, you see it now. But in the very beginning, it says everything had changed suddenly. The tone, the moral climate. You didn't know what to think, whom to listen to, as if all your life you had been led by the hand like a small child, and suddenly you were on your own. You had to learn to walk by yourself. There was no one around, neither family nor people whose judgment you respected. At such a time, you felt the need of committing yourself to something absolute, life or truth or beauty, of being ruled by it in place of the man-made rules that had been discarded. You needed to surrender to some such ultimate purpose more fully. And of course, it's from Dr. Zhivago, and but the big thing is that it was highlighted in Chris's book, and he had need for purpose written by it. Okay, so Krakauer was criticized for jumping to conclusions based upon what Chris had in his books, but again, we underline things that mean stuff. This whole idea of life or truth or beauty is very fascinating. One quote comes from Henry David Thoreau that we'll get to in a bit, and the other one comes from John Keats. He says, truth is beauty, and beauty is truth, and truth beauty. That is from an Ode to a Grecian Urn. Would Boris Pasternak, who wrote Dr. Zhivago, know that? Yeah, I knew it, he knew it, right? It's a famous poem if you studied literature. It's something you may read in AP Lit next year. But this whole idea of wanting truth, beauty, but there's talk about all of a sudden being a child and being on your own and needing, and as he says, man-made rules that had been discarded. It's very important because, as we're going to find, Chris McCandless's father was a very hard man to please. And all of this talks about in this chapter that Walt McCandless was a very difficult man to deal with and a very difficult father to impress. And his marriage is in trouble in 1965. They separate, gets a girlfriend, and of course his girlfriend, Billy, gets pregnant, and that's Chris. Now, why is this important? All right. Well, one, divorce in the 1960s is not very common. Jumping out of the house and going in with another woman and getting her pregnant out of wedlock was even less common in the 1960s. Today, with our family structure being very different, these family problems here, not sure they have the same effect. They could, absolutely could, but it's a little different social mores. On 107, Chris is said by teachers to march to a different drummer. Well, that's interesting because Thoreau says if a man does not keep pace with his companions, perhaps it is because he hears a different drummer. And so, again, this is another sort of allusion to Thoreau and his line. But again, this broken family business is a big deal, and it's not just that it was a broken family. Right? It's what's coming in chapter 12 that really accentuates the problem. If you're looking at 108 and 109, there's a lot of description of the early life with the McCandlesses. They like to travel around the country. They like to sleep in their Chevy. I do that. They climbed Long's Peak together, a 14,256-foot mountain in Colorado. I've also climbed that. Very nice. Some pictures, I think, somewhere out there. I don't think I have the keyhole in that on the website, unfortunately. But Chris's hatred for his father, because of his exacting nature, his perfectionism, still wore off on Chris, which is exemplified later on. Chris becomes more driven in college about sort of the injustices around the world. He was very big into apartheid, and you guys might not know what apartheid is, but apartheid was the segregation that was going on in South Africa, and the United States really put up a show of economic force against the country of South Africa and helped end that, ironically, not but 25 years after we ended our own. But, that's history for us. That's another class. Chris was very much did not want to go to college. The whole thing was an aversion to him because, as he said, it was a 20th century invention. He didn't want to go to college because his dad wanted him to go to college, and his dad was obsessed with money and fame and fortune and all that, and Chris rejects it. And of course, this is why we got the fact that he cares about the poor, he cares about the apartheid, he hangs out with homeless people. I mean, he sounds like a 20th century Jesus walking around here. Okay, and he's worried about the downtrodden. That's because he comes from rich, affluent people who cared nothing but money and success. This, again, how we are brought up has a huge reflection on how we are as we hit our 20s and grow into an adulthood. In 116, there's the big hook. He decides to go on a post-high school cross-country trip in his car, and it says the last 4 lines of 116, nor could anyone nobody anticipated that the journey would be the first in a series of extended transcontinental adventures, nor could anyone in his family have foreseen that a chance discovery during his initial journey would ultimately turn him inward and away, drawing Chris and those who loved him into a morass of anger. Love that word. And this is the big shift. What he discovers on his trip after high school is what sends him over the deep end. And then that is the ultimate destruction of him between his father and himself, and then ultimately leads him, for his rebellious nature, to go so exacerbated, that it leads him to the bus. So starting on 112 is a quote from Henry David Thoreau. Rather than love, than money, than fame, give me truth. Okay? And the passage is highlighted in his copy of Walden. And again, it's that same thing. And in his own hand, he wrote truth. He cannot stand liars. And his father and his mother were liars. And that is the big killer. There's also a quote from G.K. Chesterton, who's, by the way, just about on every AP Lang exam. You might see rhetorical analysis from him. For children are innocent and love justice, while most of us are wicked and naturally prefer mercy. Okay, and so children have high ideals for their parents, and when they do not come through, it sometimes crushes them when you learn that your parents don't always walk the walk. So, starting at 121, we learn that Chris has some serious daddy issues. All right, with his smoldering anger in California, he found his dad's first wife and family. And then it says right in the middle, Walt, which is the father, split from his first wife, Marcia, was not a clean and amicable parting. Long after falling in love with Billy, long after she gave birth to Chris, Walt continued his relationship with Marcia in secret, dividing his time between two households, two families. Lies were told and then exposed, begetting more lies to explain away the initial deceptions. 2 years after Chris McCandless was born, Walt fathered another son, which would be Chris's stepbrother, Quinn McCandless, with Marcia. Walt's double life came to light. So Walt, Chris's dad, was basically having two households, fathering children with two women. That's a no-go in any generation. And so this already tense moment with his father is gone. Everything his father ever taught Chris from that moment on is a lie and to be rejected and rebelled against. This is the thing that sends Chris cascading into this rebellious state where he tries to find himself on the road. On 122, in an odd passage, John Krakauer is very critical, if you will, very critical of Chris for his lack of leniency with his father. Not sure I could forgive Dad either, but he said, curiously, because Chris had this ability to forgive other people, but not his dad. I said, curiously, Chris didn't hold everybody to the same exacting standards that he held his father. One of the individuals he professed to admire greatly over the last 2 years of his life was a heavy drinker, an incorrigible philanderer, who regularly beat up his girlfriends. That's the guy he worked for in South Dakota, okay? Drunk, philanderer is a guy who runs around with different women and beats up women, okay? But Chris let that go. He lived with him, worked with him. Chris was well aware of the man's faults, yet managed to forgive them. He also was able to forgive or overlook the shortcomings of his literary heroes. Jack London was a notorious drunk. Tolstoy, despite his famous advocacy for celibacy, we've already talked about celibacy, had been an enthusiastic sexual adventurer as a young man and went on to father at least 13 children, some of whom were conceived at the same time. The censorious count was thundering in print against the evils of sex. So he managed to forgive all of these people for their sins, but not his father. That is for a psychologist to figure out. Definitely has some daddy issues. If you read these 2 pages and look through, the vocabulary is extraordinary. But I thought I might point out, right here, looks like old Chris ripped on Joe Biden in college when he was running a newspaper. Joe Biden's been around that long. And then, so keep that in mind now that this is the driving force behind Chris, okay? It's rebellion, it's rebellion against his father and everything his father stood for, which was capitalism, money, rich, wealth, and everything. Not the same as what drove Thoreau. And finally, on 125, again, another little slap at Chris. It said shortly after he attended Chris's graduation ceremony, he jumped in his car, donated all of his money to Oxfam, and then from then on he scrupulously avoided contacting either his parent or Corinne, his sister, the person he purportedly cared immensely. Right? Same things, Tom Wingfield, running off, abandoning his mom out of anger, but really hurting his sister. McCandless did it in real life. Tennessee Williams did it in real life, and Tennessee Williams wrote about it in fiction. Okay, all of these decisions that we make in life, when we make these big breaks, somebody does get hurt. All right, that's why people put it into print. That's why people write about their sins and their regrets in life. So with that is the end of 10, 11, and 12. And if there are any other questions, feel free to send them to me.